Hello and welcome back to another episode here, and really the first actual camera view and camera discussion that I want to have on this YouTube channel. So if you watched the last video and you saw me talking about my magazine Seraph and Silver, I talked about the second issue Artifacts, which I really feel is the best of all four issues, to be honest. And to shoot that issue, I used a camera. Not this camera, but another one just like it, the Pentax 67ii. It's a camera that prior to shooting that issue, I had wanted to use for a number of years. The Pentax 6x7 had always really intrigued me, just in terms of its overall format. Just it's an SLR that was blown up and made quite a bit bigger. It functions like an SLR, and I had never, unfortunately, gotten the opportunity to really use one. So I knew we were heading on this trip to Wyoming, and I was like, let's do it. This is the time. Let's take these nice, beautiful big negatives. I want to have something that will last me, and really get to explore the camera in this familiar setting. But unfortunately, after we got back from the trip, I sold it, and thinking that I would prefer to use the Hasselblad more. But as months went on, and I didn't really pick up my Hasselblad again after I sold it, I realized that I had made the wrong decision. So I sold the Hasselblad closer to the beginning of this year and bought another Pentax 67ii. And I actually, just prior to buying this one, I bought an original Pentax 6x7. I was at a camera show up in Kent, Washington, and I kind of promised myself, I was like, I'm gonna sell all this stuff. I want to get rid of a whole bunch of equipment that I'm not using, and the only thing I'm gonna buy, if they have one there even, is a 67ii. Well, they didn't have a 67ii, but they had a 6x7, and I got a really great price on it. So I sold a Hasselblad there, bought the Pentax 6x7, and spent the next couple of days up in Seattle shooting and playing with it, and it really reinforced that I was making the correct decision. And so as soon as I got home from Seattle, I hopped on eBay and found this one for a pretty reasonable price, and it arrived. Unfortunately, it took like a freaking month to get here from Hong Kong. It was a bummer, but once I finally got here, it just reinforced that I made the right call. And so you might be asking yourself, it's like, you can buy a Pentax 6x7 kit for really cheap, around like $350, and that includes the lens and everything you need to go out and throw some medium format film in it and just start shooting. The 67ii, on the other hand, is really quite expensive. For a kit like this has the 90mm 2.8 lens, it has the AE prism on it, and it has the Pentax 67ii grip. There is a difference. The 67ii grip has a hot shoe, the original grip does not. And this one can be used in conjunction with TTL metering for flash. But if you were to go out and find a kit like this, you could expect to spend maybe $1,500. And it just goes up from there, depending on condition, depending on the lens that's included. Spending $2,000 if you get the 105 2.4, the grip, and maybe if this one has a couple of scuffs on it, so maybe if it's in a little bit nicer condition, you can expect to spend a good chunk of change on one of these cameras. So what's the difference really between the original 6x7 and this guy? Well, first of all, you get a much more ergonomic camera overall. The Pentax 6x7, it's clunky and it's a tank, but when you hold it in your hands, it's not super comfortable. And even though you can get the same left grip attachment for it, your right hand is left with not a whole lot to hold on to. And there are people out there who will make custom grips that are modeled after this one, but really the ergonomics of the Pentax 67ii, excuse me, are much nicer. So there's that. The other big thing, though, and kind of the only major difference, I mean, there are plenty of small little things that you can do, but the biggest difference is this right here, which is the AE prism. And so the 67ii has automatic exposure with aperture priority, which is incredibly useful. I'll be the first to admit that I'm kind of a lazy photographer, and I do default to automatic exposure a lot of the time, mostly because I've been burned enough times with thinking that I know the correct exposure and just not getting it right, and then having the potential for a photograph that I really like be quite a bit under or overexposed. It's a bummer, and that's something that I need to work on as a photographer. But I do like having the ability and the know-how that this is here. And so with this prism, you can use a standard prism on it, but I mean, to be honest, what's the point? Because then you're spending a whole bunch more money for a body, and you're not taking full advantage of it. So if you're not going to use the AE prism, I'll stick with the 6x7 or 67. But AE prism gets you automatic exposure, as I mentioned. You also get 3 metering modes, so you get a spot meter, center weighted, and an evaluative. So kind of, taking the whole scene in really figuring out or letting the camera figure out what the best exposure is. I typically stick with a center weighted or spot just because I find it to be a little bit easier to ensure that I'm getting the correct metering on my subject. And then you also have exposure compensation over here, so from +3 to -3 stops. Also another really great feature to have, just from a usability perspective. But the camera it's funny enough, I mean, brand new, this kit would have cost you $8,000, but it's still set up in such a way that Pentax made it easy for a beginner to like kind of jump in. And so you can see that you have over here, the A is green, the evaluative metering is green, and then the 0 for exposure compensation is green. And so if you're just kind of getting into this, you can just go green, 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 and you're all set. But if you want to get a little bit more into it, you absolutely can. One of the other interesting things, though, about this is really how it all comes together. And I'll take the grip off really quick here. The grip, I should mention, it's obviously a left-handed grip, and so you can hold it. You can hold it up to your eye, and it really helps support the camera. But the problem is, without this really clunky accessory that they make that kind of goes on the side here, it's kind of tough to focus rapidly. I can kind of reach my middle finger, but as you can see, it's a little sticky, or not sticky, but kind of just clunky to use opposed to that. So if you're looking at one of these, I would say that the left-hand grip is not a necessity. It's certainly cool to have, but I wouldn't say it's needed, and it does come off. Mine's a little bit trickier to get off because I have the strap on there in such a way. But you can see that even just like this, it's still a pretty comfortable camera to hold, and the grip does add a considerable amount of heft. It makes the camera about an inch wider, and so if you're throwing it into your camera bag, it does make it a little bit more clunky, and so you can just as easily use it without the grip, like I'm doing here right now. But to use it, it's as simple as just turning it on and firing the shutter, really. Now you should know that all Pentax 6x7 cameras cannot be dry fired. So what that means is even though the shutter is wound right now, the button's not going to do anything, which is kind of a bummer because if you're looking at one, you're testing it, and you want to kind of get an idea about exposure, you're not going to be able to get one super easily to make sure that shutter's accurate. Luckily, though, because it's an electronically controlled shutter, it really either works or it doesn't. You can run into shutter capping issues, but that's not something you would ever be able to tell with the naked eye. You'd have to put a roll of film through it and kind of figure it out. The camera does run on 2 CR123A batteries, which is great for me because I have a number of other cameras that use this as well, so I always have a pretty good stockpile. And it does take the standard Pentax 6x7 lens mount. That means you can either use the newer lenses like this is an SMC 90mm 2.8 as I mentioned, or you can use the older lenses. And there's really a great variety of lenses for these cameras. And one of the other awesome things is that they're really, really cheap. Cheap respectively, I should say. There are a couple of lenses that will cost you more. For example, the newer version of the 105mm 2.4 will run you about $400. And there's also a 75mm 2.8 AL, which will run you around $800 to $900. I believe that's one of the most expensive lenses that exists for this system. But most of the other lenses can be had for under $200. You can find telephotos like a 300mm. Even the new version, KEH will often sell it for around $120. The 55mm is about a $200 lens. You can find the 75mm 4.5 for $150. There's tons of variety out there for not a lot of money. So once you're really invested into the system, building and expanding upon it is really quite easy to do. Now, I did rattle off a whole bunch of lenses there. And another great thing about the 6x7 camera and system is because it is a 6x7 format, It's pretty straightforward to figure out exactly what a focal length is in terms of 35mm equivalent, because because the frame is about 4 times the size of a 35mm frame. You really just have to divide the focal length by about 2 to figure out what the equivalent focal length will be. So this 90mm is about a 45, maybe 43 is more realistic. But the 55mm, for example, is a 28, 75 is about a 35, 300mm lens is about 150. So figuring out the correct focal length in terms of what you're looking for as a photographer and what best suits you is really easy to do. If you're a 35mm shooter, go with the 75. If you prefer the wider angle of the 28, go with the 55. And really building on the system from there. One of the unfortunate things I will say, and I do have to get going on this and kind of wrap it up, we're almost at 11 minutes already, is the finder though. There's not a whole lot of customization there. So Pentax did make 4 different finders for the 67ii. They made this, they made a chimney finder, they made kind of a waist level finder. But this is the only one with any extra metering modes, and I feel like they really missed an opportunity there to include some of the like exposure compensation or different metering in like a chimney finder or a waist level finder, because there are times where I prefer to use a waist level finder instead of the prism finder here. But unfortunately then it hamstrings the camera a little bit. That being said, it is really easy to change, and you can use the original Pentax 6x7 finders on here. You just have to push these 2 guys forward, push them in, and the finder will puff off. There are other things, jumping through this really quickly. Mirror lockup is really great to use to slow down, or I shouldn't say slow down, but to reduce the amount of vibrations. There's mirror lockup. I just said that. There's multiple exposure, I meant, which is just found right here next to the shutter button. And the ISO is easy enough to change as well. You just push in a button and move this up or down to get the correct ISO. So anyway, the Pentax 67ii it's a really phenomenal camera. It's my primary shooter these days. I take it with me everywhere, and a lot of people will say that, oh man, it's so big or it's so heavy, but really in comparison with any professional level modern digital SLR, it's not a whole bunch bigger or heavier, and you're getting this gorgeous 6x7cm negative or transparency, really easy to use, and it's got all the modern features of a camera. I mean, they made these things until 2009. So anyway, with that all being said, I encourage you to look one up, buy one if it's up your alley. But thank you for watching, and until next time.